Today I'm out here in Virginia with the Trail Truck Tour, taking a look at 7 of the latest crossovers in America. We have the Honda CR-V right over here, the Volkswagen Tiguan, this is the one with the 3-row, and then we have the Jeep Cherokee. This is, of course, the Trailhawk version with the tow hooks up front. Then we have the Kia Sportage, Kia's latest compact crossover. Kia's lineup is a little confusing to some people, but this is the one that fits in the mix. Then we have the current Toyota RAV4 right here, not to be confused with the all-new 2019 RAV4, which I think is actually a little bit more exciting than this one, but you'll have to wait until almost next year to get your hands on one. Then we have the oddball out, the all-new Hyundai Kona. This is actually a subcompact crossover, not a compact crossover, but it actually is just about as capable as the rest of the bunch and has ground clearance. It's actually quite similar to that Sportage back there. And then we have, I think, the most handsome entry in this segment, the 2018 Mazda CX-5. This is probably my favorite looking crossover, but it's not quite as capable as some of the others off-road. The first vehicle we're taking out on the trail is the all-new 2018 Hyundai Kona. This is the smallest vehicle in this comparison because the Kona is actually not a compact crossover. This is a subcompact crossover. But even though the Kona is significantly less expensive than the rest of the competition, the all-wheel drive system under the hood is actually very, very similar to the Kia Sportage that's right in front of us. And overall ground clearance is actually quite similar to the Toyota RAV4 Adventure, so I suspect that this is actually going to do very well off-road because it's fairly light. A nice touch in the Kona is that the center coupling can actually get locked in this vehicle. There's a lock button right there in the center console, and that splits power between the front and rear axles 50-50 at low speeds. This system, very much like others in the compact and subcompact crossover segment, will disengage at higher speeds to help improve stability because you don't really want that coupling locked if you're driving out on the freeway. But at low speeds, that makes this system very sure-footed. Now keep in mind that tires are, of course, one of the biggest factors when it comes to off-road traction, and this vehicle, like the others that we'll be testing today, are all wearing all-season tires. All-season tires are trying to be the best of everything. They're trying to be quiet on the road, give you some ability off-road, not too much obviously because you would need different tires for muddy situations or rock crawling, etc., but they're trying to be that balance of capability. It's a little bit difficult to tell on the camera, but it actually is fairly wet out here. And in these situations, having that locking center coupling does make a difference. Because in vehicles that don't have a locking center coupling in this segment, they're going to be sending most of their power to the front axle. And they'll only send power to the rear axle when the front axle starts to slip. But that's not what we see in this particular all-wheel drive system. Something to keep in mind when taking your crossover off-road is that there's a pretty big trend in the crossover segment right now to putting low-profile tires on your crossover. Generally speaking, the larger the wheel you get in your crossover, the lower aspect ratio the tire will be. So for instance, if you're buying your crossover and you're getting the 18 or 19-inch wheel option, keep in mind that those tires are going to have less cushion. That reduced cushion factor is going to give you a slightly firmer ride out on the road, but it's also going to mean that the tire is going to be less puncture resistant, especially for rocks and that sort of thing if you're taking your car mildly off-road. The big thing to keep in mind when off-roading with a compact or subcompact crossover like this is that we don't have as much ground clearance or as much protection under the vehicle as a more dedicated off-road vehicle like a Jeep Wrangler or something along those lines. So you just have to be just a little bit more careful, a little bit more cautious as you drive off-road. We have hit just a few minor things under this vehicle. They've been fairly small, and as long as you're driving very slowly, you'll really notice if something bad is going to happen. They've just been very small sticks, twigs, that sort of thing so far. Moving over into the Sportage, we have a very similar all-wheel drive system in this vehicle. Ground clearance is not that far off the Kona either, at about 6.8 inches or so. This is now on the low side of the compact crossover segment. It used to be that a lot of compact crossovers in America had very low ground clearance, but with the latest generation of the CR-V, they've really upped that, and we expect the 2019 RAV4 also to have a great deal more ground clearance than it does in the 2018 model year. That said, 6.8 inches of ground clearance is definitely enough to have a decent amount of fun off-road as long as you choose your driving line appropriately, and that's exactly what we're doing out here. Again, like the Hyundai Kona, we have a center coupling lock feature that locks at low speed to split power between the front and rear axle equitably. The Sportage is definitely on my recommended crossover list because of how much fun this is to drive on the road. The Sportage has an excellent driving dynamic on road, it has a fairly firm suspension, and we also have this powerful 2-liter turbocharged engine. When it comes to off-road ability, this does give up just a little bit versus some of the competition, although that center coupling lock does help a little bit. Does a decent job climbing over some of these rocks, again thanks to that locking mode, but ground clearance really is going to be the biggest issue with this vehicle, as are the low profile tires. These are going to be a lot easier to damage than what you'd find on the Cherokee, but this is still a pretty good balance off-road. However, it does favor those on-road driving dynamics to the off-road side. When it comes to overall interior design and interior quality, I think that the Sportage and the CR-V among these options are my favorites. The other thing I really like about the Sportage is the engine. This 2-liter turbo is a great engine, even though it produces less power than the last generation of the Sportage. When off-roading any vehicle, whether it's a crossover or a Jeep or a pickup truck, it's important that you always consult your owner's manual before you go off-road. The reason for that is that in the modern era of electronic safety and traction assist systems, they don't all operate the same way. So some vehicles in this category may operate better off-road if you disable traction control, and some may not. Some vehicles use the traction control system to send power across an axle, so left to right in the vehicle, whereas others don't. Some may also use that traction control system to send power front and rear perhaps. Some may not. And some vehicles may have multiple different traction modes, like we find, of course, in the Jeep Cherokee, where you can select your program and then let the computer take care of where it's sending power for you. The way that different vehicles handle freeing themselves from a stuck situation also varies. So again, it's important to keep that in mind. Some vehicles may want you to engage or disengage traction control, depending on exactly what the electronic systems are trying to do. Toyota brought along the 2018 RAV4 because the 2019 model year is not ready for production yet. Ground clearance is a bit of a problem for the RAV4 off-road. We only get 6.1 inches of ground clearance in most of the trims of the RAV4. If you get the adventure grade, which is what we're driving out here, then we get 6.5. That's actually less clearance than we find in the Hyundai Kona. And remember that the Kona is a smaller vehicle, so we have less of a breakover angle problem in that vehicle because of its overall size. It's actually easier to avoid things out on the trail as well because it's smaller. For 2019, we do expect to see a half-inch increase in ride height, and we expect that to apply to both the adventure grade and the regular models. So that really should help things out. It'll probably be around 7 inches of total ground clearance, putting it ahead of entries like the Sportage. On the bright side, you can force the coupling in the center of the all-wheel drive system to lock, and that does improve the traction in the RAV4 on muddy surfaces, icy surfaces, snowy surfaces, etc. But when it comes to overall rock crawling, it actually proved to be probably the least capable in this group. In its latest generation, the CR-V gained a great deal of ground clearance versus the old model, and that definitely makes it easier to go on rougher terrain like the road that we're on here. However, Honda has also been pretty aggressive at rolling out their continuously variable transmission to more and more vehicles. And the CVT is a little bit of a problem out here off-road because it's difficult to have a low ratio with this CVT, the way that it's programmed. Even when we put the transmission in the L mode, it doesn't stay as low as first gear in the other crossovers that we've been driving out here, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to maintain slower speeds downhill without using the brakes. Now obviously you can still use the brakes to control your speed, but if you're concerned about brake overheating, then you would want a lower gear ratio. A lot has been said, both positive and negative, about the CR-V's all-wheel drive system. This is one of the options that we're driving today that does not have the ability to command a lock of that center coupling unit. You have to wait for the car's computer to do it. And that means that generally speaking, the car is going to try and send more power to the front axle than the rear axle until there is slip. But Honda has still programmed this system to send power to the rear so that way you have improved traction in inclement weather or in stickier situations like this. You just don't have that same sure-footedness that we find in some of the competition as long as that coupling is locked. You'll definitely notice that feature versus something like the RAV4 or the Sportage or the Kona, which can all lock. However, we do have more ground clearance in the CR-V. Keeping in mind that we are driving one of the top-end trims of the CR-V, I really like this interior. I think this is one of the best interiors in this segment, both in terms of overall design, which I really like this two-tone scheme, and the imitation wood trim is actually pretty convincing, but also in terms of materials quality. We have a lot of soft-touch plastics within easy reach of the driver. This interior feels premium compared to some of the other entries in this segment. We also have Honda's latest driver's seat design, which has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, something that I really like in this particular segment. When it comes to overall driving dynamics, the CR-V does very well, even though it has one of the higher ground clearances. We have decent acceleration thanks to that 1.5-liter turbocharged engine and, of course, the continuously variable transmission, but it's not going to be as engaging as the 2-liter turbo that we find in the Sportage. However, this is going to be one of the faster entries as far as compact crossovers go. And of course, the real win for the CR-V is how practical it is, because we have a ton of cargo space in the back. We don't find an optional third row like we find in the Volkswagen Tiguan, but the folks in the back seats are going to be the most comfortable in this segment. We have a lot of headroom, a lot of legroom, and the seat design itself is very, very comfortable. Like the Honda CR-V, the Mazda CX-5 does not have any dedicated off-road modes. This is really more of an on-road focused crossover. But obviously we still have all-wheel drive, and we still have a great deal of ground clearance in this vehicle. So that means that this can go places, actually, that some of the slightly more off-road oriented all-wheel drive system equipped vehicles couldn't go. For instance, we have more ground clearance than a RAV4 or that Kona, even though those have a commendable center coupling lock. And that's noticeable out on the course that we're on, because even though on some of these slopes we get some noticeable front wheel scrabble before the rear engages, we don't have any issue with clearing the rocks and occasional things that are on the road. And that is something that you have a problem with in the current generation RAV4, the Kona, the Sportage, etc. Mazda recently gave the CX-5 a bit of a refresh, and I think this is easily the most attractive compact crossover in America. The front end really is gorgeous. In fact, I think this compares looks-wise very well with a lot of luxury compact crossovers even. It's a very, very attractive car on the outside. Now, on the inside, parts quality is a little bit more of a mix, so we definitely have some hard plastics lower on the dashboard, but overall, Mazda has done a good job of elevating the quality of this interior as well. The infotainment system is still a little bit behind the times. I don't think these seats are quite as comfortable as what we see in the Sportage or in the Honda CR-V, but overall, it's a very good interior. Now, on the downside, rear seat passenger room and, of course, cargo room are definitely lower than some of the larger crossovers, especially the Volkswagen Tiguan or the Honda CR-V. So this wins when it comes to looks, but it does fall down a little bit when it comes to overall practicality. The CX-5 is also fun to drive out on the road, but it's worth noting that this is going to be considerably slower than some of the other options because we get a lot less power under the hood. I apologize for using stock photos and video for the Tiguan. I'd like to call it a camera error, but the truth is that I mounted 4 cameras to the car and somehow didn't hit record on any of them, so I drove around on the Tiguan for a good 40 minutes talking to myself. But let's get on to the Tiguan. The Volkswagen has a pretty long wheelbase. It's around 110 inches. This allows the Volkswagen to have an enormous and practical interior with the only available third row for 2018 in this segment, because Nissan killed off the third row in the Rogue. On the downside, the long wheelbase can be problematic out on the trail. Although clearance is good for this group at about 7.9 inches, the long wheelbase means that the middle of the vehicle would scrape along some of the larger bumps on the road that we couldn't avoid. On the bright side, approach and departure angles were good compared to the average entry, and Volkswagen went a little further than most with their all-wheel drive system, giving us different modes, which they call 4-motion active control. Instead of simply locking the center coupling at low speeds, these different modes allow the vehicle's electronic systems to work together to improve traction. The off-road mode dulls throttle inputs, which is actually really handy when you're off-roading. Transmission shifts are altered, and even the anti-lock brake system gets refocused to deal with loose surfaces. This gives the driver more control of how the electronic systems work, and the most control over the entire system in the vehicle, aside from the Cherokee. On the downside, the overall size of the Tiguan, which makes it so great on the school run or in urban situations, does become a bit of a problem for me out on the trail. And now I've moved into the recently refreshed Cherokee. This is arguably the most off-road capable vehicle in this bunch. And it really is noticeable out on the road because you have to pay less attention to the line that you're traveling out here on this off-road course. Now, admittedly, this is not a terribly difficult off-road course, but for instance, in the vehicle in front of me, you do have to pay a lot more attention to your line. This vehicle, you really don't have to. It has the highest ground clearance of the bunch. It's the only model with a true locking rear differential. It's also the only model with a 2-speed transfer case. That 2-speed transfer case gives this by far the most stump pulling ability in this group. We have an awful lot of low-end torque. As I've said before, the 9-speed automatic transmission isn't exactly my favorite, but it does help this get relatively good fuel economy ratings, both in the city and out on the highway. And those fuel economy ratings are actually really good when you start taking a look at how much this Cherokee weighs. This is over 4,000 pounds of compact crossover. This is easily the heaviest in this bunch. Even an entry like the Volkswagen Tiguan with its third row doesn't weigh as much as the Cherokee. The reason this model is so heavy is because of the off-road bits. We have those tow hooks, we have the 9-speed automatic transmission with the 2-speed transfer case, and of course we have a beefed up body structure to be able to handle the off-kilter off-roading that this vehicle is capable of. Now, as I've said before, the Trailhawk, which is the model that we're driving right here, does give up on-road performance in order to get that off-road ability. But the trade-off in this generation of the Cherokee is lower than it was in Cherokees of the past, and that's why FCA decided to go for a crossover style Cherokee like this, instead of making it a body-on-frame SUV that had a little bit more on-road ability. Now, a unibody off-road vehicle is not new, of course, because the Grand Cherokee has actually been a unibody vehicle for a while. But like this, the Grand Cherokee is definitely designed for off-roading. Now, on the downside, the Cherokee on the inside is a little bit less practical. We have less cargo room and less passenger room than we find in that enormous CR-V. We don't find a third row like we find in the Volkswagen Tiguan. And I don't think this is quite as attractive as the Mazda CX-5. I also don't think the interior is put together quite as nicely as the CR-V, the CX-5, or of course the Kia Sportage. That shouldn't necessarily surprise you too much, because the Cherokee is actually one of the older entries in this segment now. Even though it has been recently refreshed, the basics of this interior do date back to when this Cherokee was brand new. There's absolutely no question about it. If you're looking for the most capable compact crossover or compact SUV, whatever you want to call the Cherokee, this is definitely it. We have class-leading ground clearance numbers, approach, departure, breakover numbers. We have the most advanced all-wheel drive system in this segment, and everything about this vehicle really is designed for the weekend off-roader going around on trails right like this. Now, obviously, if you want to tackle really extreme rock crawling, this may not be the best choice. You should probably get something like the Jeep Wrangler. But this is definitely the kind of vehicle that is easy to drive on your daily commute and definitely fun on the weekends. In addition to the capable all-wheel drive system, we also have software controls in the Cherokee that are a little bit more advanced than the rest of the competition. Instead of simply hill descent control with one selectable speed, we have a progress control mode. So you can actually set that little button down there, and then you can toggle the shifter to have it crawl at a specific speed. So right now we're set for 3.7 miles an hour. We can go all the way down to 0.6 miles an hour, and this is one of the smoother systems. Now, it's not quite as smooth. You can hear the ABS engaging there. It's not quite as smooth as the all-new Jeep Wrangler, but it is definitely smoother than what we see out of the Toyota brand. You can speed it up all the way to 5.6 miles an hour, and because of the low ratio mode, the speed is very, very consistent, even up and over these rocks right here. You can also move over to simple hill descent control if you want to. So we turn off that mode, engage hill descent control, and then we do the same thing. We toggle the shifter forward and backward, and we can go from 0.6 to 5.6 miles an hour for that hill descent control mode. That is, again, different than the other vehicles in the compact crossover segment, because most of them are simply on and off if they offer that feature at all. And lastly, of course, you have a little bit less worry about hitting one of these rocks on something important under the vehicle, because this actually has skid plates in the model that we're driving right here. Those are thick metal plates that protect the most important parts of the drivetrain. Now, obviously, it doesn't protect absolutely everything under there, so you can't just willy-nilly run into rocks, but it gives you that added layer of safety if you're doing weekend off-roading. The Jeep Cherokee might be the most impressive off-road, but I think the most surprising for me was actually this all-new Hyundai Kona. Now let's talk about how the crossovers did. Since there were 7 judges present, let's go over the communal scores first. Then I'll talk about my top picks. On this chart, lower is better. You can see that the Cherokee obviously won the off-roading capabilities section. All the judges agreed that it was hands down the best. The Volkswagen, meanwhile, won for utility, which is really not surprising given the overall size, and the CX-5 was universally the most handsome entry. But there were a lot of variations when it came to, for instance, the second best or third best off-road vehicles. So let's talk about my picks now. Even though the Kona was notably less expensive than the other entries in this competition, this had no trouble scrabbling up all the hills that we put it up against. Areas where the CR-V and the CX-5 had troubles finding traction, the Kona had no problem, thanks to the locking center coupling and, of course, the light curb weight. Now obviously this has less ground clearance than many of the larger entries, but actually it doesn't need as much ground clearance as some of them, because the breakover angle in this vehicle, which is the angle where you can attack an obstacle right here in the middle, is definitely more advantageous than something like the Volkswagen Tiguan. The Tiguan kept hitting things right there in the middle as you would go over a crest, and it would high center almost right there in the middle. That never happened in this, even though ground clearance is lower. So this is definitely my most surprising entry. Even though the CR-V struggled a little bit off-road compared to the rest of the competition, I think this is still the most well-rounded vehicle in this segment. We have an attractive and comfortable interior, we have excellent fuel economy in the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine, as well as excellent performance thanks to the CVT. But the CVT, which is the key to that performance and the high fuel economy, actually makes this a little bit less capable off-road. It definitely is a little annoying. The way that transmission shifts, the fact that there's very little engine braking for going downhill, etc., make it one of my least favorite off-road, but actually one of the best and well-rounded vehicles on-road. So it is a little bit of a conflict there. However, we do get excellent rear seat accommodation and an enormous cargo area in the back. And of course, the CR-V is expected to be very, very reliable. And that's why this is my all-around top pick. And of course, it should be no surprise that the most capable off-road entry is, of course, the Jeep Cherokee. It's the only one with all of the off-road hardware that I've already described, so clearly this is the most capable off-road. But when it comes to on-road ability or practical day-to-day living, I think this does fall behind some of the other options. Handling is not quite up to the same level as the CX-5 or the CR-V, and of course the interior space is a little bit compromised because of the off-road mission of the vehicle. But again, if you want that perfect balance of off-road ability and on-road ability, this is one of the best options that money can buy. Thanks for checking out this video. Be sure and let me know what you think about the lineup that we were able to drive this week down there in the comments section below. And of course, click that subscribe button and the button up at the top of your screen so you can support this channel. I'll see you later.